All right, folks. My research has necessitated. Say that even once slow, because I can't speak half the time. My research has necessitated another video. I was reading a Christian Reads the Quran series. That's what this one has to do with. And I was trying to figure out what battle was being talked about in Surah chapter 8, and that's a video was done a little bit before this one, where I was reading through Surah chapter 8 in the Quran and finishing that up. And I was trying to figure out what battle is this? Did historians have anything on this? Well, apparently they do. And I have it here. And so I thought I would share it with you guys so that you could have a little bit of about that as well. So let me go. This is a lot here. Should I just read the whole thing? No, it's too much. All right. So let's go here. We're going to be at page 293. This is The History of the Medieval World by Bauer. And at the bottom of page 293, it says this about this battle. Well, actually, oh, there's more up here. Okay, hold on, folks. I'm discovering as I am looking here. Let me go to, wow. There's an expedition that goes into Medina. There's a lot of history. I mean, I'm jumping in the middle of a lot of history here, and I can't go over all of it in this video. That's the problem. But I think I'll just run through it. Here we go. In Medina, Muhammad, leader of the Ummah, took on the job of judging the disputes of those outside the faith. Although he never claimed the titles, he found himself acting as both prophet and king in his adopted city. And soon he was forced to deal with the multiple practical difficulties pressing in upon the ideal community he had created. For one thing, unity based on belief was not easy to maintain among people who were accustomed to thinking of themselves first and foremost as members of particular clans and tribes. Muhammad himself had recognized distinctions among his followers. He had given the name Ansar, or helpers, to the Arabs of Medina, while the Arabs who had followed him from Mecca were known as Muhajirun, the immigrants. And we read about immigrants in Surah 8 as well. So this is a good history that goes parallel to Surah 8 really well. So they were known as the immigrants in English, but he had taken steps toward creating traditional bonds of kinship between himself and his close supporters. After Khadija's death, he had become betrothed to the 6-year-old daughter of Abu Bakr. That's where the name comes from. It's Bakr. I did not realize that was connected. Okay, that's interesting. Although the marriage was not celebrated until the little girl grew older. His new, no, they do that today, folks. In the Muslim world, I saw one just a video just this week. It was an 11-year-old girl that was given to a 40-year-old man in matrimony, and they were trying to force her to sign the marriage certificate with a pen, and she was resisting. I saw that this week in a video. That's interesting. But it's also cruel to the 11-year-old in my opinion. But anyway, uh, where was I? Okay. So he took steps toward creating traditional bonds of kinship between himself and his close supporters. After Khadijah's death, he became betrothed to the 6-year old daughter of Abu Bakr. Although the marriage was not celebrated until the little girl grew older, his new tribe, the one based on faith, was still central to his plans for the future, but ties of blood and family were still woven through his thinking. And in other ways, to make it clearer, the new tribe was not quite what he expected. Muhammad's vision for Medina had been to enfold the whole city into the Ummah. His careful protection of the rights of non-Muslims had been sincere and good-hearted, but it was always meant to be temporary, lasting only until they inevitably saw the light and became followers of Allah. However, it was becoming increasingly clear too that the Jews of Medina were always going to hold themselves apart. Muhammad, frustrated, was given the revelation that appears in Surah 2 in the Quran. Allah, the surah repeats again and again, is the same God that Abraham worshiped, the same God that the Christians worship. It was Allah who gave Moses the book and followed him up with a succession of messengers who gave Jesus, the son of Mary, clear signs and strengthened him with the Holy Spirit. Jews and Christians were wrong to insist that no one shall enter paradise unless he be a Jew or a Christian. Both shall enter paradise along with the Ummah if they submit to Allah and do good. And that was a quote. So for Muhammad, Jews and Christians were practically already inside the Ummah, and he could not understand why they continued to hold themselves apart. Nor was he pleased with all of the Arabs who were converted. The Ummah was now the most powerful tribe in Medina. The city schedule had been reorganized around the 5 daily prayers that Muhammad prescribed for faithful believers. Fasting and the giving of alms to the poor had been written into the city law. The place of worship, the mosque Muhammad had built, was the city's center. That must be the sacred mosque, singular mosque that I read about in Surah 8. It was now politically advantageous to be Muslim, and some of the Arabs were joining the faith to get ahead. But the biggest difficulty of all was posed by Mecca. Then the apostle prepared for war. His biographer, Ishq, says, matter of factly, in pursuance of God's command to fight his enemies, whom God commanded him to fight. The revelation given in Mecca, allowing the Muslims to fight against those who had expelled them from their homes, was still in force, even though the Meccan enemies were now distant. And beginning in 623, the year after Hijrah, Muhammad began to send both helpers and immigrants out from Medina on exploratory pre-fighting missions. His first target was not Mecca itself, but rather the caravans that went between Mecca and destinations to the north, passing Medina on the way. This is what I was reading in Surah 8 just tonight. This really clears a lot of things up for me as far as the history goes. So he was going to target the caravans. Raiding caravans was not exactly an act of war. For centuries, Arabs had considered the caravans of other tribes to be fair game. Getting valuable food and water from passing caravans would certainly make life in Medina easier, and in preparing to raid the caravans from Mecca, which were almost all but in preparing let's see, which were almost all Quraysh. Muhammad was also sending a message. Loyalty to the Ummah had replaced the old tribal loyalties, and the ties of birth had been broken and supplanted with ties of faith. For several months, the exploratory missions from Medina simply involved spying, reporting, and occasionally negotiating with the caravan leaders. No one was injured until a party from Medina, spying on an erroneous and rich Quraysh caravan, decided to attack and take its goods. In the scuffle, one of the Quraysh merchants was killed by an arrow shot from a Medina bow. When the expedition returned to Medina with its booty, Muhammad was furious, not because of the killing, but because it had happened during the sacred month in which the fighting was forbidden. A sacred month in which fighting was forbidden. It was just this sort of disregard for ancient religious traditions that had led to the corruption of decadence, the corruption and decadence of Meccan society. He did not intend for Medina to go the same way. His anger threatened to pull the new community apart. The other members of the Ummah began to whisper that the raiding party was damned outside of Medina. The Quraysh spread the word that Muhammad himself had committed sacrilege. Peace was not restored until Muhammad received another revelation. Of course, of course. That'll fix it. Another revelation. Breaking the sacred month was bad, but the sins of the Meccans were much worse. Quote, fighting in the prohibited month is a grave offense, says Surah 2. But it is graver in the sight of Allah to deny him and to drive out his followers. Tumult and oppression are worse than slaughter. Nor will they cease fighting you until they turn you back from your faith if they can. Man, it reads like Surah 8. I'm telling you, just like Surah 8. Here we go. This relieved the tension in Medina, and the raiding party went back to their homes in relief. But the ripple effect of this revelation was much wider. The scope of the original permission to fight back when wronged had almost invisibly expanded. It was now permissible to fight back against those who would continue to wrong you, given a chance. The revelation gave Muhammad and his followers the justification that they needed to launch a full-scale attack on the Meccan caravan. In 624, a large caravan loaded with goods from Syria passed Medina. It was led by an old enemy of Muhammad's, a man named Abu Sufyan. The path he was on led past the wells of Badr. And here's the Battle of Badr that I kept reading about in Surah 8. The path he was on led past the wells of Badr, an oasis and watering place south of Medina. Muhammad assembled 300 men, a large force, to overwhelm a single caravan and set out for the wells to intercept the caravan there. Abu Sufyan had been expecting trouble. His scouts went out ahead of him, asking for news of any large parties on the move and brought back intelligence of the planned Medina raid. Abu Sufyan sent a messenger to Mecca asking for reinforcements, and a huge army turned out, 1,000 men, with representatives from every Quraysh clan. The conflict between Muhammad's religious revolution and the old order had finally come to a head. The Quraysh army from Mecca met the smaller force from Medina at the wells of Badr on March 17th, 624. So there you go. That's the Battle of Badr that's talked about in Surah 8. Rallying his outnumbered forces, Muhammad called out that any man who was killed fighting with that steadfast courage would certainly enter paradise. Driven by loyalty to Muhammad, by religious fervor, by hatred for their enemies, and by the fear of losing everything they had gained, the men from Medina turned away the larger army. Only 50 or so of the Quraysh died, but the rest were driven back. Muhammad and his men took the goods recovered from the caravan. Abu Sufyan had escaped and taken part of it back to Mecca with him and returned to Medina in triumph. It was the first battle of Islam, a turning point in the life of the Ummah. Between 624 and 630, the fighting escalated. The Ummah in Medina drove out by force two of the Jewish tribes that refused to recognize Muhammad's authority. Major battles between armies of Mecca and Medina took place in 625 to 627. After this second battle, the Battle of the Trench, named because the people at Medina dug a moat in front of their city to protect it from invasion. The final tribe of Jews was also exiled from the city. They had refused to take part in the battle, which was a violation of Muhammad's declaration that Jews and Arabs support each other both in peace and in war. The Battle of the Trench had itself been a draw. Cold weather had forced the attackers from Mecca to withdraw, and the Jews' non-participation probably did not alter the outcome. But the Muslims in the city were indignant over this breach of trust. The Jews were besieged in their homes and finally forced to surrender. They were given a choice: conversion to Islam or death in slavery, and chose the latter. We will never abandon the laws of the Torah and never change it for another. Ishaq records them as saying, Muhammad appointed a judge to pronounce a sentence. A man named Sa'ad, who was himself a Jewish convert to Islam. Sa'ad decreed that the men be executed and the women and children made slaves. Ishaq's account is stark. Then the apostle went out to the market of Medina, which is still its market today, and dug trenches in it. Then he sent for them and struck off their heads in those trenches as they were brought out to him in batches. There were 600 or 700 in all, although some put the figure as high as 800 or 900. The new community was under attack from outside, and the conditions of its existence had altered. There was no longer any place in Medina for neutrals. By 630, the Ummah at Medina had grown so large and powerful that Muhammad was able to assemble an army of 10,000 helpers, immigrants, and numerous soldiers from outlying tribes who either had accepted Islam or were willing to make common cause with it. At the head of this army, he marched against Mecca for the final time. Once again, he was able to offer a justification for the attack. Nomadic allies of the Quraysh had attacked nomadic allies of the Muslims. This was a hostile act against the people of the faith, and the Muslims were simply fighting back. As Muslim power had grown, the people of Mecca had begun to learn more and more towards as Muslim power had grown, the people of Mecca had begun to lean more and more towards making peace with a powerful neighbor to the north. In fact, two treaties in the previous decade had allowed Muslims to enter the city on occasion and worship at the Kaaba. Even Abu Sufyan the owner of the caravan, that had been attacked at the wells of Badr, now favored a truce. When Muhammad arrived on the horizon with his army, it became perfectly clear that the truce would involve surrender. Abu Sufyan, or Safan, however you pronounce it, standing on walls, extracted a promise that the Muslims would enter the city without bloodshed. Muhammad agreed, and the gates were open. The promise was kept. The only violence done was to the idols of various deities around the city, which were smashed and thrown down. Muhammad himself worshipped Allah at the Kaaba. He was joined by Abu Sufyan, who had agreed to convert to Islam. From this point on, Mecca was the core of Islam, the place of greatest devotion for any Muslim. Muhammad centered himself in the city, and for the next 2 years, he directed various campaigns from his Meccan headquarters. More Arab tribes began to convert. His conquest reached so far down into the south that Himyar fell under his sway. The Ummah was becoming a kingdom. But Muhammad was not a king. He had given the Arabs a collective identity. What he had done for them was not unlike what Alaric had given to the Goths, or what Clovis had done for the Franks. He had taken an assortment of competing tribes and provided them with a way to think of themselves as a group. I don't know that I'm going to go a whole lot further. It's a long chapter. But we now know what the Battle of Badr was about. Well, maybe I can finish this out. Let me finish it out as I was checking the pages here. The Arab hatred for kingship meant that Alaric's role as warrior king and Clovis's role as Christian king were closed to him. Instead, he was the prophet, the creator of a new people. In 632, just before his death, he preached a farewell sermon that laid out the mixture of religious and civil regulations that shaped this new people. Allah was forbidden you to charge interest. I'm sorry. Allah has forbidden you to charge interest. Your women have the right to be fed and clothed in kindness. Worship Allah. Say your 5 daily prayers. Fast during the month of Ramadan. Give your wealth in charity. Perform Hajj or pilgrimage to Mecca if you can afford to. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab. A white has no superiority over black. No prophet or apostle will come after me, and no new faith will be born. Not long after delivering the sermon, Muhammad grew ill and within a few days died. He left no guide to his succession, no one appointed to receive his spiritual authority, no one to act in his role as ruler of the Ummah, no one to lead further campaigns. Perhaps he had no thought that a kingdom of Muslims would exist after his death. Certainly, he had no intentions of leaving a hereditary kingship of some sort over his followers. His enormous achievement had a dark side. The identity of his followers was so closely bound up with his own person that the new Islamic community immediately began to spin apart. Old tribal loyalties, freed from the almost hypnotic effect of his personality, reasserted themselves. Abu Bakr, his old friend and father of his young wife Aisha, was chosen as his successor by a gathering of Muslims in Medina. But the election was not uncontested. Other Muslims, primarily in Mecca, wanted to appoint Ali ibn Abu Talib, Muhammad's son-in-law. He was busy washing Muhammad's body and mourning his death while the gathering was electing Abu Bakr. It is not entirely clear what Ali himself thought of the situation. According to one version of events, Ali did not seriously argue with the selection of Abu Bakr. as the next leader of the Muslim people. He retreated from the controversy, considered his position, and eventually offered his support to Muhammad's friend. But other accounts suggest that he believed he should succeed his father-in-law and disputed Abu Bakr's election. And as a footnote says, what remains unclear is whether Ali himself accepted Abu Bakr's legitimacy, or whether he simply ceased to press his claims out of a desire to maintain unity among the Islamic tribes. Muslim oral traditions preserve both points of view. The former tradition is accepted by those who call themselves Sunni Muslims. They believe that the passing of the caliphate to Abu Bakr was legitimate, and that the line of caliphs, I should say, caliphs, who followed him is thus also legitimate. Those who disagree and support Ali as the divinely chosen successor of Muhammad were known as Shiite Ali, the party of Ali, today Shiite Muslims. The division did not occur in Islam until considerably later, but it is rooted in the events of 632. Either way, a number of Arabs resisted Abu Bakr's leadership with or without Ali's support. Abu Bakr reacted not as a prophet, but as a general. He divided his own followers into 11 armed groups under 11 competent commanders, and assigned each one the task of subduing by force the areas where resistance to his leadership was making itself known. The subjugation was successful. Abu Bakr became the sole heir of Muhammad's power. The Caliphate Arasu Allah, the Caliph, representative of the message of the Prophet of God. His original title, in fact, was Caliph of the Messenger of God, acknowledging his second place status in the line of revelation. But the strike forces did much more than subdue rebellion. Later accounts called the resistance to Abu Bakr's rule the Ridda, the apostasy, and credited Abu Bakr, with holding Muhammad's conquest together. In fact, the 11 columns under the leadership of Abu Bakr's general and right-hand man, Khalid, fanned out and expanded the Islamic kingdom by conquering nearby tribes that had not yet fallen under Muslim domination. The conquest spread under Abu Bakr's supervision. The rest of the peninsula fell, tribe by tribe and oasis by oasis, under the rule of the Caliph. Within a year, Arabia was united behind him. This left Abu Bakr at the head of an enormous armed camp that was not, as Medina and Mecca had been, necessarily convinced of the truth of Islam. It was, in the words of historian John Saunders, a kingdom filled with recent, tepid, and unstable converts, a powder keg with Abu Bakr sitting on the lid. Abu Bakr decided to turn its energies inwards. Medina had prospered while grappling with outside enemies, noting nothing welded a people together like a war. In 633, he sent his general Khalid against the first enemy outside of the peninsula, the Persian Empire. After the long bloody war with Byzantium, Persia had been further weakened by ongoing quarrels over the crown. Finally, the grandson of the crucified Khosrow II, Yaz, Yazdegerd III, a curly-haired man with joined eyebrows and fine teeth, al-Abari writes, had managed to take the throne by appealing to none other than Hercules for help. He had been king over the remains of Persia for only a year when Khalid and his Khalid and his Arab armies appeared on the other side of the Euphrates. At the same time, other Arab troops were making their way towards the Byzantine provinces of Palestine and Syria under the command of four other generals. Three more pages, 2.5 pages. Go. Interesting history. The Byzantine troops put up a stronger resistance than Abu Bakr had expected. And just as Khalid was getting ready to attack the Persians, Abu Bakr recalled him and sent him westward to help out the Palestinian front. Yazdegerd III had gotten a very brief reprieve, but at the expense of Her Heraclius, Byzantium, Heraclius. Okay, so Byzantium, like Persia, had suffered from the long war. Its soldiers were tired and depleted. The combined Arab troops defeated them in two large battles, capturing Damascus and moving through Palestine into Syria. Just as the consequences were gathering momentum, Abu Bakr died. So right, and he started to make progress, and then he just dies. Okay. So right in the middle of the momentum, he dies. He had been caliph for 2 years and was an elderly 61-year-old man. I beat him by 5 years so far. Ha! He had been careful to leave strict instructions as to the succession. He wanted his son-in-law, Umar, to inherit his power, and the transition occurred in Mecca without chaos. On the battlefront, the armies pressed forward without halting. Umar knew that his first task was to keep fighting. Al-Tabari tells us that when he was first acclaimed, he was addressed as Caliph of the Messenger of God. Okay, that works. Too long-winded, Omar said. But when another caliph comes along, what will you call him? Caliph of the Caliph of the Caliph of the Messenger of God? You are the faithful, and I am your commander. It was a moment of transition. As commander of the faithful, Umar was no longer merely Muhammad's successor. He was the commander-in-chief of a new and expanding empire. At this point, Heraclius realized that he had misjudged his enemy. This was not a bothersome raid. It was a serious and terrifying challenge to his power. To meet it, he put together a great coalition force. His own men, Armenian soldiers, Slavs from up north of the Black Sea, Ghassanid Arabs, and anyone else he could find. In this way, he managed to field an army of 150,000. His coalition met the invading Arab force. His coalition met the invading Arabic forces at the Yarmouk River in Syria. Fighting went on for 6 entire days. The narratives of the battle are confused and contradictory, but they all end up in the same way. The Byzantine army was routed. The Heraclius was forced to give up the provinces of Syria and Palestine, which he had just gotten back from the Persians. Rough time, man, I tell you. Jerusalem held out until the end of 637. Heraclius' only victory was in managing to get the fragment of the true cross out of the city and back to the Constantinople before Jerusalem was forced to surrender to occupying Arab forces. Meanwhile, Khalid turned back eastward and marched against Persia. He stormed all the way to Ctesiphon, which surrendered in the same year as Jerusalem. Yazdegerd survived the conquest of the city. I'm sorry. Yazdegerd survived the conquest of the capital and fled eastward, still alive, but without his capital city. The conquest continued. In 639, Arab armies invaded the Byzantine holdings in Egypt, And by 640, all the Heraclius Egyptian land, except for the city of Alexandria, was under Arab rule. Heraclius himself was in increasingly poor health. He had brought the empire back from the brink of destruction, only to see it fall away again in the face of an unexpected and unstoppable eruption of force from the south. He was unable to put together a counteroffensive in 641. He had a stroke and died. Man, they keep dying in the middle of battle from natural causes here. This left Constantinople in a bad position in a dreadful time. Heraclius had left the rule of the city to his son Constantine III. Just keep adding, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh. Anyway, who was in perpetually poor health. Again, in poor health. He suffered from epileptic seizures. As insurance against Constantine III's sudden death, he had also made his younger son co-emperor. His younger son, Heracleonas, was Constantine III's half-brother, child of Heraclius' second marriage to his own niece, Martina. Okay. This marriage had been very unpopular in Constantinople, which widely regarded it as a breach of biblical law. When Constantine III died a few months after his coronation, just as his father had feared, Heracleonas became sole emperor. And because he was only 15 years old, his mother, Martina, became his regent. The army revolted under the leadership of the general Valentinus and took Heracleonas and Martina captive. Both were ritually mutilated before being sent into exile. Heracleonas' nose was split and Martina's tongue cut out. Different times, folks, and just the cruelty was incredible. Mutilating a claimant to royal power was a ritual method of making him ineligible for rule. It had never been carried out in Constantinople before, and it wasn't actually foolproof. Heracleonas was perfectly capable of ruling with a slit nose, and it seems to have played on the Old Testament regulation which stipulated that deformed priests could not minister in the temple. The sudden appearance of ritual mutilation in Constantinople suggests that the emperor had become much, much more than a king. He was also some sort of guarantor of God's favor, the channel of God's grace. The people of Constantinople saw Heraclius' incestuous marriage as a sin that was bringing judgment on them. As the unknown religion spread towards them from the south, they were desperate for a king who would bring salvation. The options were limited, and the Senate chose Constans II, son of the dead epileptic Constantine III. He was only 11, and on his ascension, he read to the Senate a statement that concluded, "I invite you to assist me by your advice and judgment in providing for the general safety of my subjects." The words had undoubtedly been provided for him. The Senate wanted Constans as the symbol of God's continuing presence in the palace at Constantinople, but they intended to keep power for themselves. Neither the symbol nor their power seemed to work. The empire continued to shrink both to the west and to the east. In 642, the year after Constans II was crowned, the Lombard king Withari carried out a quick and savage conquest of the remaining Byzantine lands in Italy, leaving only the Ravenna marshes under the control of Constantinople. Of the few Byzantine troops left in Italy, 8,000 died in the fighting and the rest fled. At the same time, Alexandria fell to the Arabs. Egypt was completely gone. Hispania had disappeared years ago. Italy was almost out of reach. North Africa was cut off from the rest of the empire. Only Asia Minor and the land around Constantinople itself remained in Byzantine hands. The new caliph of the Arabs, Umar, had his eye on even wider conquest. He sent an army through the conquered lands of Persia, far to the east, all the way to the Makran, the bare land that lay past the far eastern Persian border. Almost 1,000 years earlier, the Makran had killed off three-quarters of Alexander the Great's army as they marched home from India. Apart from straggling settlements along the coast of the Arabian Sea, where the sparse population subsisted on fish. Try it again. Apart from struggling settlements along the coast of the Arabian Sea, where the sparse population subsisted on fish, there was no food or water in the Makran, just trackless sand and rock. But the desert had almost destroyed Alexander's legendary army. Um, but the desert that had almost destroyed Alexander's legendary army was familiar with the Arabs. They knew how to survive in the dry sands, and they pressed on through the Makran until, as al-Tabari tells us, they reached the river. They had come to the Indus, the edge of India itself. That's that whole chapter. Uh, Fascinating history. For me, it is anyway. 42 minutes on that. It's a lot. But after reading this, if I went back and read Surah 8 again, maybe I'll just listen to what I read on YouTube here. It'll make a lot more sense because now I have a historical understanding of the battle that actually took place and what was actually happening in the world at that time, or the world that Muhammad was a part of. Um, Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. All right, I love history. Hope you guys do too. I'll catch you next time here on the Sea Files.